talk series. There's hardly an Indian, I'm sure, who's not heard of the name of Sir M Visvesvaraya in some context or the other. Most of us know him as a civil engineer, one of those rare professionals to have been conferred with the award of the Bharat Ratna. Arguably the most famous Indian engineer of 20th century, Sir M Visvesvaraya was also a public administrator, a constitutional analyst, and a developmental thinker whose ideologies and legacy went on to shape life in India for all of us even today. He should also be rightfully credited with many innovations in the field of irrigation, multipurpose dams, piped water supply systems, technical institutes, industrial enterprises, in fact, even transforming entire cityscapes. Many books have been written by Sir M Visvesvaraya himself and on him throughout these years. A fascinating but recent addition to this list is a book called Engineering a Nation, The Life and Career of Sir M Visvesvaraya by Aparajith Ramnath. In this book, Aparajith gives us an in-depth insight into the almost 8-decade-old public career of Sir Visvesvaraya, and his book is based on extensive archival research, field visits, and interviews. We are extremely fortunate to have the author of this book, Aparajith Ramnath, with us today. And along with our own PhDs, R. Gopu and Ashwin Prabhu, he will be discussing in depth the various facets of this book. A warm welcome to you, Aparajith, and to Gopu and Ashwin. Before we move on to the main program, I'd like to give you a brief introduction about Tamil Heritage Trust, which is our own organization. Tamil Heritage Trust, or Tamil Paramparaya Arakattalai, is a non-profit organization started by a group of like-minded volunteers almost 14 years back with the explicit objective of understanding, appreciating, disseminating, and celebrating information related to India's history and heritage, not just for the scholarly and the academic-minded, but the enthusiastic public as well. Towards this end, THT has undertaken various initiatives and conducts various programs throughout the year. Chief amongst these are our talks and seminars. Our most popular initiative is the monthly Heritage Talk series, and as I already told you, we are in the midst of the April 2025 edition. We are extremely proud and happy to say that this program has been conducted without interruption for almost 14 years now. We merely changed the format from in-person talks to online through and post-corona. Another initiative of ours, which is more academic and scholarly in nature, is called the Indology Festival, which is an annual online event conducted in the month of June. Across 6 days, 12 subject experts and scholars try and figure out an in-depth academic perspective to a pre-decided topic. In June 2024, our Indology Festival was titled Harappan Civilization, A Century of Discovery, and was meant to commemorate the century of the discovery of the Harappan civilization and its announcement to the world at large. Another initiative of ours is called Pechu Kacheri or Oratory Concert and is conducted in the month of December every year to collaborate and coincide with the Margari Isai Kacheris of Chennai. Last year, in December 2024, our Pechu Kacheri was called Tolliel Kapiyam, Archaeological Expeditions in Tamil Nadu. And based on the feedback that we received, we are extremely happy to say that this program was a great success, both amongst the audience and the participants. Apart from the talks and seminars, at THT, we also conduct various workshops and classrooms from time to time. We have one-day workshops called How to See a Museum, How to See a Temple, etc., which are conducted in 2 sessions. In the forenoon session, we have a series of lectures, and in the afternoon session, the participants are practically taken to a site where we elucidate upon what was discussed earlier. Then we have classroom sessions, which we conduct on and off on a variety of topics like Grantham script, ancient Indian astronomy, ancient Indian mathematics, etc., where anyone can register and participate. Alamar Avai is another initiative of ours which is targeted at the school teachers of Tamil Nadu. Over a series of weekend lectures, various aspects of Indian history and heritage are discussed, the idea being that the teachers take these back to their schools, thus spreading awareness among their students. Docent training is another initiative of THT, and we are extremely happy to say that version 2 of this was completed only recently. About 30 people graduated, and they will be presenting historical sites and heritage monuments in a professional manner to the enthusiastic audience. Version 3 is going to be launched really soon. Site seminar is another initiative of ours, which is more of an in-house activity, largely meant for our own self-education and self-enhancement. Every year, we zero in upon a particular site anywhere in India, and our volunteers study various aspects of this site over several weeks. We have several in-house seminars after that, and then armed with all this knowledge, we visit the particular site to have an immersive and total experience. We also try to come back and document what we have seen. This is usually undertaken in the month of January every year, and in January 2025, we visited areas in and around Gwalior and Jhansi, credited to the little-known dynasty of the Kachapagadas. From the Tamil Heritage Trust, we have also instituted 2 awards, which are given out annually. The Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award is one of them, which is given for individual contributions in the field of Indian history and heritage. Into the 5th year running, last year, this award was received by architect Madhu Voteri for the extensive work that she has done in Hyderabad in promoting Indian heritage, especially amongst the young. The V. Venkaya Epigraphy Award is the other award given by us and is given for individual contributions in the field of Indian epigraphy. Named after V. Venkaya, who was the first official Indian epigraphist, this award has been instituted by Sunita Madhavan, his great-granddaughter. THT has been entrusted with the responsibility of administering this award. Epigraphist V. Vedachalam, a retired senior professional from the Tamil Nadu Archaeology Department, was the recipient of this award last year. We have our own YouTube channel where you will find links to all our past talks right up to today's talk. Kindly subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to receive notifications of future events. These are our social media handles, and this is our mailing address. You can mail us here to join our mailing list, or if you want to contribute in any way to THT's activities in a voluntary capacity. Last but not the least, as I already told you, we are a voluntary organization. We do not have any dedicated financial backing. So any kind of contributions are welcome. You may use this QR code or this address to contribute generously. That, in a nutshell, was about Tamil Heritage Trust. Now, coming to today's event, as you must have all realized by now, there is a slight change in our format today. Unlike our regular talks, Aparajith Ramnath, the author of the book that we will be discussing today, will be in conversation with R. Gopu and Ashwin Prabhu, where he will be talking about how this book came about, what was his process in writing it, and what are the key aspects that he has discussed in his book. He will also be reiterating his core concept that exploring the life of Visveswaraya is tantamount to exploring the emergence of the Indian nation as a whole. Now, to briefly introduce our own Gopu and Ashwin, a software professional, a part-time teacher, a prolific speaker, blogger and writer in mainstream media, a self-taught expert in Indian astronomy and ancient scripts, R. Gopu wears all these hats with aplomb. However, as a passionate heritage enthusiast, his speciality lies in the fresh insight he brings to the art and architecture of a bygone era. As a co-founder of the Varahamihira Science Forum, Visveswaraya is of special interest to him. Ashwin Prabhu's meanderings have taken him to the worlds of banking, teaching, heritage education, writing, and development sector work. Author of 2 books so far, Classroom with a View, Notes from the Krishnamurti Schools, Sculpted Stones, Mysteries of Mamallapuram. Ashwin enjoys working with teachers and children in thematic areas where philosophy, history, art, and literature happily intersect. Now, to know more about the author, the book, and its contents, without further ado, I invite the panelists to take center stage and enlighten us further. Once again, a warm welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gauri, for that, as always, very warm and generous introduction. We're very happy to be here, both Gopu and I. Welcome, Aparajith, to this forum, and welcome to all our viewers at Tamil Heritage Trust. We're delighted to be hosting this month's panel discussion. And Aparajith, thank you so much for agreeing to be here.
Thank you.
And of course, this is turning out to be quite a family affair, isn't it? We did have Srimati Ramnath, your mother, and Shreya Ramnath, your sister, speak about the glorious heritage of Godavari a few months back. And now we have you here, of course. I think what's left is to invite Mr. Ramnath, perhaps, to kind of complete the circle. Yeah, fantastic to have you here. Thank you so much. We are here, of course, today to talk about your most splendid book, Engineering a Nation, The Life and Career of M Visvesvaraya, which has drawn quite a few very warm reviews, which talk about not just the academic rigor, I think, which you brought to this work of yours, but also a literary quality, right? A literary flair, if I may say that. So we're very much looking forward to this discussion. Your book, Engineering a Nation, of course, is not really the first biography of Sir M V. In fact, Sir M V himself has an autobiography to his credit, but I would wager that yours is the longest biography of M Visvesvaraya at 700 plus pages. I think quite befitting of the centurion that the man himself was. And I think Gauri set the stage nicely earlier this evening when she told us or reminded us that M Visvesvaraya was not just a civil engineer, perhaps what we know him for best, but he was an administrator, a statesman, a social commentator even, right? So in many ways, what we would commonly refer to as a Renaissance kind of man, right? So there are several exciting and interesting strands we are hoping to unravel in this conversation this evening, Aparajith. But let me kind of start by bowling a few warm-up balls at you, given the cricket enthusiast you are as well. I think very early on in your introduction to the book, you kind of state that your intent is not to write a hagiography of Visvesvaraya, but instead to kind of create a biography which critically examines the man, right? And takes into account also the socio-political context into which he was born into, and how that may have influenced the choices and career decisions he made, and eventually shaped the personality he was itself. And I think that's a refreshingly honest and frank disclosure to make right at the beginning of a biography. And we would very much like to understand that better. But like I said, to kind of get us warmed up to the conversation, I'll just kind of throw out 3 questions out there, and then you can use that as a springboard to go into some kind of a general introduction to the book, your work, the subject, and the process. So 3 things really to start things off. How did Visvesvaraya suggest himself to you? Did you choose to do this biography? Was it a conscious decision, or were there other circumstances which fashioned this? So that's one. In your role as a biographer, given that this was not the first biography of the man, what was unique about your attempt, or what do you see as unique in your attempt to document the life and work of Visvesvaraya? And then, of course, like I said, the process, what was your research process like? Given I think it's a 7-year effort, if I'm not mistaken. right? Almost 7 years of hard work and research and the writing itself. So tell us about your research process. What were the challenges that threw up, and what was that experience like? So if you can stitch together these three questions and kind of use that to get us started this evening, I think that will be very nice.
Thank you so much, Ashwin, for that wonderful introduction and these questions that helps kick off the conversation. Thank you also to Gauri for the invitation, and Gopu and Ashwin, both of you, for investing the time and effort to plow through through this book, and having a conversation about the book is in detail is the sort of is what ultimately someone who's written a book like this looks forward to, because that's when you finally it goes out into the world, and then you hear some reactions, and then you get to see whether it has kickstarted a conversation or not. And I'm really, really looking forward to it, not least because Tamil Heritage Trust is doing such wonderful work. I'm, of course, familiar with some of your sister organizations and other events, Gopu has done another conversation with me on my earlier book several years ago. I think it's now 5 or 6 years. So time has really flown, but I'm a great admirer of the thirst for knowledge, which is animating this whole exercise. And in some ways, as an academic, it's an experience that I have lost out a little bit, because you get highly specialized and you start to know more and more about less and less. And I really look forward to the time when I will make time to go back to reading widely outside, my areas of expertise and research. And this kind of a forum seems ideal for that. So perhaps I'm going to attend some more of your events in the future. And just to start the conversation, I think I'll keep in mind the three questions you asked. You asked me how I came to write this book, and you asked me how it's different from other or earlier biographies, and a little bit about the process. So I'm going to answer the first question separately, and then I'm going to do a short sort of introduction to the themes and outlines, the timelines of Visvesvaraya's life, because we're going to go into, I'm sure, a thematic discussion. But before that, I think it's useful for the audience just to be on board with, when was he born, what did he do, what were the highlights of his career, and what is this book trying to do. So I'll do that, and then perhaps we can talk separately about the process at an appropriate time. So how did I come to write this book? I think it really starts with, it depends how far back you want to take the story. But I just mentioned my first book, which came out of my PhD work, and that was a history of the engineering profession in late colonial India, so between 1900 and 1947. And that was, of course, a much more straightforwardly academic book, in the sense it was a monograph. It was written for fellow academics. And it was not about an individual. It was not a narrative history. It was more a sort of historical sociology, you might call it, or a social history, though those two things are slightly different. So it was about this profession of engineering, which of course we know is very prominent, has great cachet in today's India, and how it came to occupy that position. And it zooms in on a very important transition point in Indian history, when a profession which at the start of the 20th century is thoroughly dominated by government services and expat British engineers, sort of transitions to one that is more representative of, or more diverse in terms of the kinds of engineers that are in it. And so there's industrialization, and there are different kinds of engineers coming in. And most importantly, there are Indians coming in. So all that is playing out against a certain political backdrop, tumultuous change, of course, economic change, and the sort of twilight of the colonial era. So when I was doing my research for that book, of course, Sir M Visvesvaraya's name would keep popping up. various accounts, various sources. But I was not writing about a single person. I was not writing about individuals. I was writing about a collective. I was writing about a sociological process. And so I knew that I would never be able to sort of pack in enough of his story into that analysis. And I sort of stored it away in my mind that I was going to write about him later. And in many ways, he's an outlier. He was not, um, his experience and his career was not completely typical of what most engineers or most Indian engineers at that time would have experienced. And so I decided that merited a separate treatment. Um, but of course, I thought that okay, a biography is a completely different kind of project. It's something that one has to learn how to write differently for. One has to learn how to write a narrative, and of course, you have to be much more of an investigative reporter in a sense, because when you're writing a broad analysis, um, you can look at larger trends and you can ask analytical questions. But when you're writing about an individual, you really have to chase down every trail, right? You have to pin down all the details. And so I assumed that it was something I would do sort of much later in life. And of course, there was an element of serendipity to it, because just as my first book was coming out, I'd written some general articles, and I was actually asked by editor at Penguin to write about Visvesvaraya. So that was the most sort of pleasant coincidence, I think. And then of course I said I jumped at it, because I said, now I'm not going to wait for another 10 years to become mature enough to do this. I'll do the maturing along with the project. And sure enough, by the time I finished the project, I am much older, much grayer, and hopefully have done justice to to the the project. So that's how it came about. And that tells you a little bit about my approach, because I'm looking at Visvesvaraya's life uh, with the background of having studied that period of Indian history in a more general sense. And so this book is my opportunity to bring together the personal and the larger sort of historical strands. So having said that, I'm going to just move quickly into my few slides that I've got to introduce the book. Is it visible in full screen?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So Visvesvaraya, as Gauri and Ashwin have both mentioned, um, is known as an engineer. His birthday is celebrated as Engineer's Day. He's perhaps the most famous Indian engineer of the 20th century. But as we've already established, he had a very multifaceted career, and he did many other things as well. And those legacies are with us. So we mentioned that he was a constitutional analyst and an economic thinker, development thinker, and so on. So if you've been to the Brindavan Gardens near the KRS Dam near Mysore, if you're a graduate of the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, or the former UDCT, University Department of Chemical Technology from Bombay, now Mumbai, if you have lived through the era of the 5-year plans and the Planning Commission, if you're of course an engineer of any sort, if you use Mysore sandal soap, you're partaking of an element of Visvesvaraya's wide-ranging legacy. So let's see a little bit about this person and when he was born and what he went on to do. He was born in 1861 in a village called Muddenahalli, which is just outside Bangalore. It's about 35 kilometers away. Now it's quite close to the new airport. And he grew up there and in the nearby taluka town of Chikkaballapur, and moved in his teens to Bangalore, where he studied in various missionary institutions, the Wesleyan Mission High School in Bangalore, and then moved on to the Central College, where he did a BA, which was the degree was awarded from Madras University, because Mysore did not have its own university at that time. And although it was called a BA, his major was in what was then called natural philosophy and mathematics, so science subjects essentially. And then he won a scholarship from the Mysore government to go to Pune, where one of the few engineering colleges existing at that time in India operated, the College of Science, as it was called then. And he obtained a degree in civil engineering. It was called a licentiate. And this was in 1884. And then he went on to a long and distinguished career in the Bombay Public Works, in the Bombay Presidency, in the Public Works Department. And essentially, he was involved in many different projects, mostly to do with water supply for various towns across India, irrigation projects, of course. He was even sanitary engineer, so that's in being in charge of water supply and drainage. I think it's a very underappreciated fact that he spent 25 years of his most sort of formative professional experience in the Bombay Presidency, ranging from he lived in Pune city for around 14 years, but he also was posted places like Surat, places in Sindh. Now, of course, not in India anymore. Places like Sakkar, and then in other places in Maharashtra. One of his first postings was in Dhule, for instance. So he really worked in many different places. He even did a brief visit to Aden, which is a port in the Middle East, which was under British Indian control. And during this time, he engaged very deeply with questions of irrigation, of agriculture, modernization of agriculture. And it's really the time when his professional sort of identity is taking shape, his beliefs are taking shape. And I'll talk a little bit later about the intellectual influences that are happening at this time. When he was around 50, or not even 50, but close to 50, he returned to the state of his birth, the princely state of Mysore, and he was invited to be chief engineer, a position which, of course, was very rare for Indians to achieve in British Indian provinces. Although Visvesvaraya, had he stuck on in the Bombay presidency, may have got there. He took early retirement, went and became chief engineer in Mysore state, served for 3 years in that capacity. That was the time when the famous Krishnarajasagar Dam on the Kaveri was begun. And then unexpectedly, or rather in an unprecedented move, he was made Diwan, or Prime Minister of the state, in 1912, and served throughout World War One, and for a period of 6 years as Diwan of Mysore, where, as is well known, he headed a sort of a program of modernization and transformation in Mysore. Many iconic projects are associated with this time. He did the Krishnarajasagar Dam, was begun under his watch. Of course, it took much longer to complete. The Bhadravati Iron Works was also begun in his divanship. Mysore University was set up, first university in a princely state, the Bank of Mysore, Mysore Chamber of Commerce, and so on. He then quit as Diwan and entered the third phase of his professional life, by which time he was around 60. And this phase was a phase that saw him enter the national stage. And he's a sort of expert for hire, not for hire really, but an expert who's peripatetic. He's taking on different projects. You can see here a number of influential committees that he becomes a member of. He becomes a member of the Committee on Technical Education in Bombay in 1921. He becomes a director later on the Tata Steel Company's board. He's a member of various inquiry committees, not least the one that looked into a huge scandal at the time to do with the creation of the Back Bay Reclamation Project in Bombay. And what's really interesting is that at this point, firstly, his influence is moving beyond Mysore and the Bombay presidency to a pan-Indian stage. And one of the questions is how he did that. But most interestingly, he is moving beyond the area of professional competence or the professional training that he has undergone. So he's becoming something of an economic expert. As you can see, he's heading the Indian Economic Congress in 1924, which is the premier professional body, or the premier annual meeting for professional economists at this time in India. Has renowned economists of the time like C. N. Vakil, B. G. Kale, um, and several other luminaries and several British professors in various colleges and so on. And it's quite remarkable that a practicing engineer with no formal training in economics becomes the chairman of this conference, which of course is a largely symbolic role. But it didn't stop there. In the next year, he became chairman of a committee called the Indian Economic Inquiry Committee, which became very, very influential also in formulating certain questions of how one could assess the national wealth and economic well-being of the nation of a nation, although it was a nation still coming into being at that time. So there's a remarkable diversification that's happening. And in the interwar period, he's strengthening his credentials as a thinker on development by publishing several pamphlets and screeds, Reconstruction in Post-War India, 1920, Planned Economy for India, 1934. He's seen as one of the pioneers of planning in the sense, not in the sense that he was the only person to talk about it, but he was one of the earliest and most influential public speakers or public writers to popularize the idea of the 5-year plans. And this is happening from the 1930s, much before this idea is actually implemented in independent India. So you can see that he's really putting himself out there as a speaker on what the nation, no more just Mysore, but India as a whole, needs to develop. And there are a lot of concepts and assumptions embedded in this. I mean, what was his view of a developed nation? Well, one of the most important elements of his vision was that it involved rapid industrialization. And I'm sure we'll get to talk about that a little more in the questions. And not surprisingly, given what I've just said, scholars have pointed out that Visvesvaraya's worldview or his development canvas was remarkably it laid the foundation for what became later the sort of Nehruvian consensus. Many elements of it: industrialization, the importance of the state, the importance of higher technical education, the importance of planning. All of these were foreshadowed in Visvesvaraya's thinking. Of course, he did not become very influential in the Nehruvian era, partly because he was already around 90, and partly because he differed from Nehru on certain aspects. Primarily, he was not in favor of the sort of socialist slant that the post-independence government took. Today Visvesvaraya is enjoying a resurgence as an icon. We are seeing railway stations, metro stations being named after him. Delhi, Bangalore, there's a swanky new air-conditioned railway station in Bayappanhalli near Bangalore. Some of you would have seen newspaper reports when it was opened recently. There are scholarships named after him. His birthday, as I said, is celebrated as Engineers Day. And he's out there as a symbol, or he's being revived as a symbol of national development. And it's important to engage, therefore, with what his vision was. You can see in Karnataka, it goes without saying that he's a household name. It's statues, busts, portraits are found on every street corner. You can see on the left here, this is a bust of Visvesvaraya outside a Ganesha temple in Mandya district, and it says Annadatta Sir M Visvesvaraya. So, because of his association with the KRS Dam and turning that landscape into a sugar belt and an agricultural region, a very prosperous region, he's revered in that region. On the right, you can see a bust of him outside the Institution of Engineers in India, in Bangalore. And even Google did a doodle a few years ago. So he's clearly a very important figure to engage with, and yet we seem to know relatively little about him beyond the broad highlights of his career. For a person who lived for 100+ years and who worked actively for nearly 80 years, it demanded a lot more, careful analysis of what he stood for and what he achieved. And so, question: why do we need to study him? Well, one reason is that his view of the world was a fundamentally technocratic view, a view that saw science and technology as being the keys to solving several social issues and to promoting the development of a prosperous society. And we are again in a highly technocratic moment. But we need to understand the promises and the limitations of technocratic visions. We have, with the benefits of hindsight, we also know several other things which were not apparent in Visvesvaraya's time. So, for example, large multipurpose dams, are they the only way to promote electricity generation? You know, what are the environmental fallouts of it? We can talk about smart cities and digital solutions, but to what extent do they clash with other sort of democratic norms or issues of privacy? These are things that we need to reformulate, not to reject the technocratic worldview, but to understand afresh where it comes from and where it can really promise to help us. The other reason is that he's known as an engineer and an administrator, but very few people know the full range of Visvesvaraya's engagement with Indian history. I'll just give you one example, which is that he was quite active politically, which is very much against the image that we have of this engineer. He's seen as an apolitical person who just focused on his technical work. And in fact, to some extent, that is the source of his appeal. But I mentioned here also that his pan-Indian contributions have been somewhat neglected. So he's seen today almost in many quarters as an exclusively Mysorean figure, which I think is a gross injustice. He's definitely a pan-Indian figure. And even in political history of India, it's as important to understand his thinking as it is to understand Gandhi or Nehru or Ambedkar or Tilak. So what was that political role? Well, from a young age as an engineer, he was closely influenced by M.G. Ranade, who you see at the top left of the slide, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. He was very much part of what was known as the moderate or the liberal, the Indian liberals, who modeled themselves on the British liberals, the 19th century political movement. And he also was part of the classical nationalist school of Indian economic thinking. So Ranade and then Dadabhai Naoroji before him talked about the drain of wealth, the importance of moving from an agricultural to an industrial economy, the importance of the state playing a role in promoting industries, and so on. And Visvesvaraya was definitely closely influenced by that line of thinking. Later in his life, in the 1920s, he worked very closely with two other Congress politicians, Madan Mohan Malaviya and M.R. Jayakar. And I'll say a little bit about his role with them later in the discussion. But suffice it to say that, this was a period when people were pushing for the roundtable conferences. They were pushing for constitutional reform. They were pushing for what was known as dominion status for India. And these are, the stuff of history textbooks, political history. But none of them mentions Visvesvaraya. Fact is that he was very closely involved in these debates. In fact, a draft constitution for India with dominion status was drafted by him anonymously on behalf of M.R. Jayakar, and then circulated in influential circles. Later the Nehru report of 1928 also builds upon some of these discussions. So there's a very strong political role, and I can mention more about that later, that Visvesvaraya plays. Now, even with the engineering side, it's shocking that, as someone who's so famous as an engineer, Ashwin, you talked about so many existing accounts of him, but many of them actually skip over his engineering career very quickly in sort of one chapter, a few pages, and then go on to talk about him as a statesman. So I think we need to engage seriously with the technical side of his work, and more importantly, understand him as a product of his time. So rather than looking at him as a genius who descended fully formed on earth, he was certainly extremely competent as an engineer. But what were other people doing around him? How did he achieve this larger than life status as an engineer? How do we contextualize his innovations and his achievements? So if you look at what's happening around him at that time, and because of my previous work, I know this. There were several other Indian engineers who had stellar careers. There's Rajendranath Mukherjee on the left, who was a Calcutta-based contractor and engineer whose company built the Victoria Memorial and various other things. On the right, you see Lala Gangaram, who's known as the father of modern Lahore. In the middle, you see a younger engineer, A.M. Khosla, who was involved with the Bhakra Nangal Dam and became chairman of Central Water Power Commission. So there are several others, very accomplished Indian engineers. So what explains Visvesvaraya's preeminent position in the public understanding? We need to investigate this. We need to understand what was special about him as an engineer. We also need to understand more about the person. I mean, the person has been wiped out in favor of an icon, right? A person, an individual, has his own intellectual influences. He has his own gifts, his own flaws, his own foibles. So, what was he like as a personality? What goes behind that standard image of a grim, serious person with a Mysore turban and a three-piece suit, right? So these were all the things that pushed me to analyze his life once more. Essentially, let me say there have been several attempts in the past to write about him, but while many of them are extremely valuable, for a person like me coming to this project, you read what's already been written and you get a sense of what's happening. I think the approach with which they were written was largely admiring. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. But for me, as an academic and as an individual, I was curious to have the genius behind these achievements explained rather than assumed. What goes into the making of an exceptional life and career? What is the historical context? What's happening around? Who are the people? Who are the teachers? Who are the other professionals he's interacting with? What explains his particular worldview? What was he reading? What did he study? What were his particular experiences? What was his personal life like to the extent that it impacted his working life? So all of these things, I think, were essential. But I think there's also very important analytical questions that remain to be answered. And one of those was, what is the link between Visvesvaraya, the engineer, and Visvesvaraya, the expert on national development and economics? Surely these are not two separate, unrelated phases of his life. One informs the other. And I was keen to understand, as a historian of science and technology, we'd always talk about how science and technology is embedded in social factors in society. And the reverse is also true. It influences our ideas about society. So what is the link between these two elements of his life? What is the historical context that shaped him, as I just mentioned, and how his various interactions shaped his worldview? Most importantly, I wanted to be very, very faithful to the sources. I mean, we've all got WhatsApp forwards, we tend to make deities out of the people we admire. So we get WhatsApp forwards about Visvesvaraya saying, he was going in a train one night and then he suddenly pulls a chain and then he tells the person that, he could hear, just by hearing the sound of the train, he could tell that there's a crack in the tracks further up. And then there are these imaginary conversations he has with Gandhi, which are, circulated as WhatsApp forwards. So I think it's important to understand that there are legends, but how do we really emphasize verifiable, verifiable information and use that as our basis for understanding? So throughout, I've emphasized primary sources and triangulation. So I've traveled extensively to all the places where his papers, letters, reports, etc. Are housed: Mysore, Bangalore, Delhi, got some records sent to me from London. Of course, I went to all the various institutions and places which were associated with him, just to understand what he was seeing and what the atmosphere was like. So that's where I'm going to stop this introduction, which I think has already gone on too long. This is just to acknowledge all the sources of the images that I've shown you. Thank you very much.
You can stop sharing now, Rajat. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Aparajith, for that. I think incredibly broad sweep which you covered in such a short time. And you, of course, touched on all the key intentions of the book, really, so to speak. But also, I think it kind of brought to the forefront your own interrogation, which the book really does, of the man, his work, the times he lived in. Of course, I think the very fact that we've covered so much ground in such short time also kind of ended up preempting some of the questions which we have. So we won't go into some of those. But I think from a reader standpoint, I think what becomes quite apparent to me is your first book, prima facie, is the history of a profession. And your second is nominally the history of a man. But really, in both these attempts, you're also writing the modern history of a nation, right? And that really was, I think, one of the questions which we had. But I think it came out quite clearly in how you said the context in which the individual lived and the work which he did needed to be understood. You, of course, spoke about the politics of Visvesvaraya. You spoke about the fact that he's a technocrat. And we'll try and come back to that point on what does it mean to be a technocrat and the worldview of a technocrat a little later in the conversation. But I'll start off with one question from my side, and then Gopu will jump in as well with some questions after you respond. I think you touched on the fact that he had quite a curious mix of interests, right? I mean, he was dabbling in education and starting institutions, very interested in education as a tool of social transformation. But he also saw economic policy as something which had the potential to shape a modern nation. And then, of course, he was sitting on corporate boards and a whole bunch of things which he was doing. But I would like you to perhaps also comment on Visvesvaraya's view of what it meant to be modern. Yeah. So, like the book tells us, Visvesvaraya constructed his entire life and his life's work on the idea that to be modern meant to be pragmatic, right? And I'm going to kind of quote what you attribute to Visvesvaraya in the book. To be modern meant to be pragmatic and to challenge, and within quotes, the inquisitorial power of religion and the overpowering influence of tradition and custom, and the association of all of this with inactivity. We have stood before the world with folded hands, a picture of helplessness and despair, lost in dutiful veneration of everything pertaining to the past. So essentially, this is his push for modernity, right? For thinking like a modern person. And then you, of course, weigh in by saying Visvesvaraya's emphasis on practicality, on overcoming fatalism and sloth, on industrial production as an aid to material well-being, and the paternalistic assumption that intellectuals knew best what was good for the masses. So there's this interesting kind of dissection of what does it mean to be modern, or what it meant to be modern in Visvesvaraya's times. And I think what comes through clearly is what was his idea of modernity. So I was hoping you could kind of talk us through a little bit about that, and also bring in your own critical observations of that to kind of start off, and then Gopu will chip in with his next question after that.
Thank you, Ashwin. I think that really kind of puts the finger on the animating impulse of Visvesvaraya's life, and it is essentially to achieve modernity for India. I think that's the and it's not by any means something that is confined to him. I mean, he's living in a time when many Indian intellectuals are wrestling with this question. What does it mean to be modern? What does it mean to be a modern Indian? Some of them are asking, do we need to be modern? Gandhi, for instance, would be asking a version of that question. But most people are assuming that to be modern is something that is desirable, but their understanding of that modernity is slightly different in each person's case, depending on their life experience, depending on their intellectual influences and their beliefs and so on. The powerful quote that you read out is actually comes from Ranade. It's from a piece that Ranade wrote. But it's striking how similar the worldviews of Ranade and Visvesvaraya are, in the sense that Ranade, of course, is 20 years older to him and died in 1901 or so. But when Visvesvaraya starts writing about social issues and development, he really he echoes some of these concerns. And you're right that in both of their cases, what they what modernity means for them is yes, respect for the past, but not not taking refuge in the past, not blindly seeking a golden age in the past. They both start with a certain understanding of um, material poverty that they see around themselves, hunger, poverty. Remember that a person like Ranade is living through the second half of the 19th century, which sees a series of devastating famines. Visvesvaraya himself is an irrigation engineer in the Bombay Presidency when there's a devastating famine in the 1890s, closely followed by a plague outbreak in Western India. So for them, they're seeing hunger, they're seeing destitution, and it hurts them both from a humanitarian point of view, but also from a point of view of national pride. And they're asking, what is it that we can do to ensure that that our nation doesn't have to endure this? And so for them, being modern means using the fruits of science and technology, using the fruits of the most recent advances in knowledge to focus on the here and now, to focus on the material and not just the spiritual, to focus on what can help people live a more comfortable, dignified life. So it is, in that sense, a fundamentally technocratic worldview. It is a social reformist worldview. Ranade, of course, was very much involved in social reform. The standard issues of the day, widow remarriage, um, you know, various other issues. I think he was president of a social conference at that time, which ran in parallel with the Indian National Congress. Industrialization was central for both of them. The idea, their understanding of economics was that agriculture places, relying on agriculture places a limit on the well-being of the nation because there's only so much you can grow. So the only way to grow richer is to industrialize, to move from an agricultural nation to industrial nation. Of course, many of these things are coming from their being steeped in European history, British history, in the colonial institutions they're going to. They're looking at the recent experience of the West. They're looking at what's happening what happened in the UK, what happened in America, and crucially for Visvesvaraya and for many other intellectuals, what's happening in Japan. He was a great admirer of Japan, which in a way, for many Indian nationalists at that time, helped to help to bridge the gap between what they were aspiring to, which is a Western model, and at the same time, they were able to tell themselves that there's nothing particularly Western about this, because here's an Asian country which has achieved the same thing after the Meiji Restoration, and very, very rapidly, in 20, 30 years. Visvesvaraya goes to Japan in 1898 when they're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration. He spends 3 months, takes extensive notes, visits the universities, the factories, etc. And so they're really keen on replicating what they see as the successes of the industrial West and Japan in India. So for them, modernity is about all of these things. It's about the centrality of science. It's about being material. It's about being materially focused. It's about being progressive and certain liberal. Of course, the liberal politics come into it. So it's the idea of the individual and the state having direct relationship, not mediated by ties necessarily of community and caste and other such institutions. And it's a worldview that's shaped by the idea that rationality has to be at the core of what we do. So this is what modernity meant to these people, and of course, it comes with many dilemmas. It comes with many contradictions, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about this.
Rajit, my question was about Visvesvaraya, the engineer. He was like the first celebrity engineer really in modern times, right?
Yeah.
And so he kind of established a reputation, in places like Sindh and Bombay province before really being even Hyderabad, before being kind of invited to, in his home state. You have a whole chapter on that, right? The land of your
Yeah.
birth or something like that. And so, and if you mentioned that he was the first engineer to become a diwan, or the, what do you call it, the chief minister, the chief advisor for a princely state. All the other earlier ones were lawyers or, traditional kind of aristocrats or something like that, or literary people, something like that. How did that come about? I mean, and two, did any other engineer attain this kind of status? Did any other engineer become a diwan or, respected? You see the Constituent Assembly and things, it's all like businessmen and lawyers. It's almost nobody else.
Right.
Or social reformers, as they call themselves. Did any engineer attain this kind of status in society?
Thank you. That's a two-part question. I think the first is that yes, he was indeed. It was an unprecedented happening when he became Diwan of Mysore. Um, in Mysore, even in Mysore, it was not entirely expected. The person who was first councillor and was expected to become Diwan was H.V. Nanjundaya, the famous educationist and anthropological scholar. And Visvesvaraya sort of superseded him in a sense. And how do we explain that? I think a number of things. When he became chief engineer in 1809 to 1812, he became very, very close to the Maharaja. He became very influential. But I think his worldview coincided with what the Maharaja, the royal family wanted to do. They were also, remember, Mysore was one of the so-called progressive princely states. And there's a complex cultural and political imperative at play there, because Mysore was run directly by British administrators from 1831 to 1881, and there was something called the rendition, where they turned it back to the Wadiyar dynasty in 1881. And from that time, they were constantly in a sort of struggle to prove to the British that they were indeed worthy of having that autonomy and increasing their sphere of autonomy. And the way to do that was to show that they were on par with or better than the British provinces of India in all the modern markers of progress. And so it came in handy in that sense. There were also certain more specific political factors that may have helped Visvesvaraya. There's something called the Madras-Mysore conflict. There are these two cliques in the Mysore court. And so most of the traditional bureaucrats had been imported from Madras presidency. The earlier divans, Rangacharlu and Seshadri Iyer, for example, obviously came from Madras presidency. And there was a competing Hebar Iyengar faction in who saw themselves as more native to Mysore, and so there was this kind of court intrigues going on. And Visvesvaraya, being, of course, he was a Mysorean, but he was coming from outside. He was coming from Bombay Presidency. He was coming from British India. So in a way, he kind of is the right man at the right place at the right time, and a lot of things work in his favor. He's also got the approval of the British. So remember, there's a British resident sitting there who has to approve the choice of Diwan, at least informally, if not formally. So all of these things come together to enable him to become Diwan. And yes, the other point is, of course, I mean, let's give him some credit. When he was chief engineer, he showed an interest in matters that were far beyond the pay grade of an engineer. Like no previous chief engineer had ventured to make plans on those kinds, or to he set up something called the economic conference, for instance, before he was Diwan. So anyway, so these are all some of the circumstances in which he becomes Diwan. Interestingly, I don't think there was any other engineer who became Diwan, certainly not in Mysore, but perhaps not in any other princely state after that. But I think he becomes a, sorry.
Even in the British aristocracy, if you look at it,
Yeah.
all the governors and the high officials who came, they were from the aristocrats, sometimes businessmen who became aristocrats, and so on. very few engineers who kind of breach into the power positions of power.
The only one sort of, there were few exceptions. One is Lord Sydenham. His name is George Clark, who became governor of Bombay, who had some kind of an engineering background, and he was actually a good friend of Visvesvaraya's. And but yeah, I mean, it's quite rare. And but I think Visvesvaraya does inaugurate an important trend in technocratic advisors, because if you see in the Nehruvian period, someone like Mahalanobis, of course, is not a lawyer, he's not from literary background, the physicist who becomes a statistician, and then in the late 20th century, is from Sam Pitroda to down to the present day. It's the era of the technocrats, right? I mean, economists can be seen as technocrats. So today, I mean, there's enormous cachet for someone who is seen as coming from a professional, non-political background into a political role. And I think Visvesvaraya certainly helps to lay the foundation for that kind of a I mean, another friend of mine called Arun Sukumaran wrote a book on technology. He also talks about other people like Vikram Sarabhai, right? Vikram Sarabhai, Homi Bhabha are also important technocrats. Although they're scientific administrators, the power they wield is far beyond merely science and scientific institutions. So I think, yeah, Visvesvaraya, there's no other engineer who becomes a divan, to my knowledge, but he does inaugurate something important.
Yeah, I think that provides a nice segue into our next kind of question on what it means to be a technocrat, and also looking at what the worldview of an engineer is. But before that, I think what we learned from what you're saying is it would just be a simple understatement to say that Visvesvaraya was ambitious, because like you said, he's going above his pay grade in one sense, and he's reimagining his own role as a chief engineer and then the divan of a single princely state. So I think it speaks volumes about the ambition of the person himself. But let's go into this examination of what a technocratic view of the world could mean. And Aparajith, I think it is fair to say that in many ways, and in almost all ways, I think your book is a very balanced appraisal of Visvesvaraya, his life and work. But also, I think I found it fascinating that tucked away in the pages of the book, you kind of let slip a little of your own worldviews and ideologies. So, for example, there's one excerpt where you say, it was an era when engineers saw themselves as equipped to remake the world. And in keeping with the times, Visvesvaraya never thought of consulting sociologists or anthropologists when undertaking changes that would fundamentally alter the social fabric of a centuries-old city like Hyderabad. And here, of course, you're talking about the work he did in Hyderabad in the aftermath of the floods. But what was that process like to write about this giant of a man, but to also kind of entangle yourself in his own worldviews and interrogate them for yourself? And I think it is in many ways, I think, quite ironical that we live in a world today where there's this small band of engineers who truly believe that they can solve all the world's problems, right? So this seems to be in many ways the flavor of the last, let's say, 120 years of modern global history. So just talk us through that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ashwin. I mean, just start with your first comment. He was incredibly ambitious, but I think it's important to mention that was a certain kind of ambition which which was not purely personal. I mean, it had a sort of it had a more sort of public background to it. And the question about the technocratic worldviews and where I stand on that, I think, I'm cursed by not being able to see things in black and white. I always kind of look for the middle ground, look for the nuance, and while that may be good in some instances, it also leads to a lot of difficulty in my life. But having said that, I think that it's important in today's world to do precisely that, to look for the details and look for the nuances, because we're living in a very shrill world, a world that wants simple answers to many things. And for me, writing this book, exploring what this person did through his very remarkable life was a way of, for me, of trying and understanding several things, and what do I think about several fundamental problems in our world, because all the things that he dealt with are with us, right? Um, Not only the specific legacies of the built environment that he created, but also the same kinds of problems, the same kinds of dilemmas are still with us. And I think that I have tried to keep my sort of my views or my reservations out of the main narrative as much as possible. It comes in either in the conclusion to an individual chapter, like the part that you just quoted here, or there's a lot of what I think in the epilogue, where I'm talking about his legacies and what it means for us today and so on. So that's where I allow myself to come in and reflect on what this all means for how we can see our world. And of course, that's a very personal view. Somebody else could read this book. And in fact, it's my aim that this book should be laid out in such a way that even somebody who disagrees with my reading of what the world should look like should be able to read this and feel that they know Visvesvaraya and say to me, look, maybe he was right on certain things which you don't agree with. Maybe he was wrong on certain things which you are promoting, right? So somebody else should be able to read this book and come to their own conclusions about the significance of this person in the career. So that was my hope in how I would lay this out. I think we have there's a concept called presentism in history writing, where we tend to sometimes impose the categories of the present and our prejudices and things that we know now on what was happening in the time we are studying. And sometimes that just doesn't make sense, because those things weren't known or weren't being talked about, or those categories didn't exist. So I'm very careful to try and understand whatever's happening through the lens of the people who are involved at that time, through the lens of what debates are happening at that time, what's the contemporary world. So it's a for me, it's a form of time travel. How can I try and be a fly on the wall, be there, and reconstruct that? Of course, we can never completely be there, but can we do that? And I'm really delighted that you said that you enjoyed the literary quality, because for me that was part of the attraction of doing a biography as opposed to an academic monograph. It gives you the leeway to do that a little bit. I don't mean being fanciful and describing the weather on a particular day when we don't know what it was like, but I think we can still do a certain amount of reconstruction, which is fascinating. So to come to the substance of your question on technocracy, it is my personal view that yes, you talked about the Silicon Valley bros and the power they wield in the world today. It's my view that of course, we live in a highly engineered world. We benefit hugely from it. We live very comfortable lives, many of us, not all of us, but many of us. But there's absolutely no doubt. We know today that there are areas where that kind of a worldview has significant costs, not least environmental. We're talking about climate change today in a way that was just not on the agenda 100 years ago. Um, uh, we are battling against time. There's also a fundamental contradiction sometimes between technocracy and democracy, and I have a section on this later on, because the idea that science and technology enables us to fashion a better world, of course, comes with the idea that there are only certain people who are qualified to do that fashioning, and that those certain people tend to be a kind of elite, very often an unelected elite, who have influence, wildly beyond the imagination of most common people. And so, when they sort of get it right and are enlightened, it's beautiful. But when they don't, it's also something to be concerned about. So I think what I meant there is, and these things are now accepted. You talk about riverfront projects today. He was trying to beautify the river, the Musi in Hyderabad after the floods of 1908. At that time, an engineering team could do the entire thing. Today, you have to do a social impact assessment. You have to do an environmental impact assessment, right? You have to at least pay lip service to these concerns when you moot a project like this. Again, I stress that this does not mean that we can apply these standards. At that time, as you mentioned, it was a time when the engineering profession was at its peak around the world. It was a time when there was great promise. There was a great sort of optimism and utopian vision that came from this. And it was not like these people were intentionally overlooking other views, but when we look at it in hindsight, this is what we can see.
Gopu?
Yeah, I think there's some very good points made there. You can't look at the past through just the lenses of the present. And I agree. I think as a person, you can look at it through your eyes only. You can't try to be too neutral, I suppose. But yeah, some of his, ideas, you could reading through the book, you could see some of the ideas were very egalitarian. He wanted, things that be considered very modern, very radical. But other times, some things are just simply totalitarian. It's like, I don't, everybody should be educated, but none of your education matters. It's what I say that matters. Kind of. It gets like, where does that come from? That's fascinating. No, let me ask something that's slightly offbeat here. His travels, the part where he, is after his career as Diwan ends, he decides to travel to England and Europe and America and Japan on his own money, right? He's earned a lot and he decides to travel. I think the fact that he even wanted to travel, we know that people, like one generation earlier, crossing the seas was such a
The
huge
taboo.
taboo.
Yeah.
And here is a man who's not only traveling, he's traveling on his own money. And to me, the fact that he went to those places and, even today we do this. People take tourist photos of places. They go to Buckingham Palace, they go to see the Mona Lisa, wait 4 hours to see the Mona Lisa, whatever, right? There are some artistic, touristic attractions, nothing engineering. And this man was exactly the opposite. He went to see the engineering works, he went to see the water and irrigation projects and canals, and, he even walked through the sewers. I mean, that, and when he goes to Japan, he studies their education and he studies their schools and sees how, it's not so much travel for pleasure as travel for, trying to refocus it and see what he can bring back to India, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was utterly fascinating. So can you say something about that? Actually, I also want to, before I forget,
Yeah.
walking through the sewers, this is, today we associate sewers with, it's like untouchability and caste prejudice, and, we are talking about manual scavenging and all this stuff. And here is this man literally walking, to study these things. I don't even know how to place that.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think it's amazing, and for me, one of the one of the sort of conundrums or the enigmas of this is how do we understand this? How, I mean, it can't be that there's just this one guy who randomly decides that I'm going to break out of convention. So I try to trace it in the things he's reading in his childhood, the kinds of books that he's got, and he's a big fan of Victorian self-help literature, Samuel Smiles, and who wrote a series of books called Thrift and Character and all of these things. He's actually, today we have this thriving self-help literature, right, or in various genres. You won't believe it, but Visvesvaraya is an avid consumer of self-help literature, including books like How to Sleep Better or How to Sleep More Efficiently and all kinds of things. So he was a guy who was trying to improve himself from day one. And he you're absolutely right. For him, international travel was at the core of the educational project. Not only for himself, but he emphasized it for all the people who worked under him. He said, "You must go abroad." He actually set up a system where a delegation of business people from Mysore went to Japan to make contact with various businesses in the 1910s. And of course, there's a passage in the book where I talk about this. The British are actually worried about this, and then they send a spy to go and track them because there are other revolutionaries in Japan and so on. But for him, he's basically his emphasis is that going abroad is the only way you can broaden your mind, the only way you can see, what's happening elsewhere, the way that you can learn. And why reinvent the wheel? If someone is doing well, why don't you just understand it and come and replicate it? Now, of course, we know that has certain problems. Not, it's called, in modern day political science, we call it modernization theory versus dependency theory. Modernization theory is a kind of aim to paint the world in a kind of homogeneous, in homogeneous colors, which just doesn't work for various reasons. But having said that, that's what that was his aim, and I think you're absolutely right. He stressed this idea that this taboo is one that is meant to be broken. He was willing to take that risk. But of course, there are again some personal circumstances which enabled him to do some of this. He had a tragic personal life in his the early part of his life. But from the age of 30, he was essentially single, earning very well, good salaries, consulting fees, and other things. And he had the means to go abroad. He also had very influential industrialist friends. So when he went in 1919 on a world tour, he's not traveling alone, but he's traveling in a group with people like Vithaldas Thakursi and other cotton magnates from Bombay. That's the other very interesting thing about him. We talk about the historical prejudice against business among the Indian intelligentsia. He had none of that. He idolized these business magnates and these industrialists, because he saw them as agents of modernization, agents of development. And so he was very close friends. I mean, close friends in the sense he was not the kind to be, pals with anyone. But when I say close friends, he discussed problems and he discussed his ideas with these people. But yes, there's also a personality thing. He was a very reserved person. He had a dry sense of humor, but he was a very serious person. He wanted to maximize. He wanted to work as much as he could. And maximize his time. And yes, this thirst for knowledge. There are a lot of people, contemporaries, talk about his fact that he used to carry a black notebook everywhere and keep noting down facts and figures and statistics. This mania for statistics he was, even before Mahalanobis, he was the one who was writing about the importance of statistics and information. And it's very important in an era where information is not easily available. I mean, today it's available at the click of a button. But for him, data, we talk about big data today, for him, data had to form the bedrock of any kind of policy or any kind of advancements. You needed to first assess where you stood. And so in all his speeches, he would start with saying, Canada's literacy is so much, Mysore's literacy is so much. There are so many universities in Australia, there are so many universities in India. So this comparative statistics was an obsession with him. And he would actually go and collect and amass all this data, talk to people, and certainly that was a big source of inspiration for whatever he tried to do in India. So I agree. I think that's quite remarkable. Later in his life, when he's 60, 70 onwards, it becomes quite common for Indians to travel abroad. And he heads a delegation of businessmen, manufacturing organizations to London when he's 86 or something like that, 85. And he's going and taking them to meet the Secretary of State for India and asking for certain things and all of these things. It's interesting because he didn't have any stake in it. He didn't have any money in any of these industries, as far as we know. He didn't invest in them. He was director or advisor to some of them, but he was very, very, very involved in pushing for these things.
Ashwin?
I'm good. Gopu, should we move on to some audience questions? I think we are at 6:50 now, so maybe another
Screen freeze.
15 minutes. Gopu, can you hear me? Gopu, I was suggesting we move on to the audience Q&A. We are at 6:50 now. Maybe we can take a few questions from the audience and Aparajith can respond to them.
Go ahead. Do you want me to start, Ashwin?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, there's this. So, Aparajith, there is this Vagish. We take audience from the YouTube feed, questions from the YouTube feed. We ask it on behalf of them. There's this person called Vagish who's asking, what does this evolution as a political thinker look like? For instance, what does this anonymously drafted constitution look like?
So, there's a lot one could say about this, but as I mentioned, I mean, his Visvesvaraya's political shaping starts with his years in Pune in the 1880s, 1890s. And actually, he becomes close friends with, as I said, Ranade, Gokhale, and others. And they are members of these reformist organizations called Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, the Deccan Sabha. Then there is educational Deccan Education Society, which sets up Ferguson College. all of these things. But they are a kind of moderate constitutionalist nationalists. And though he's employed by the colonial bureaucracy at that time, so he doesn't formally become a member of any of these bodies, becomes very close to these people. So when he goes to London in, I think, 1908 or so, he becomes member of something called the of the National Liberal Club in London, where many Indian liberal politicians used to use that as their base when they went. And there's actually a recommendation from Gokhale which says, I know Mr. Visvesvaraya, he's a liberal in politics, right? And I just mentioned what liberal had a particular meaning at this time: individual rights, right to property, some form of representative democracy, um, and and of course a certain egalitarian mindset. So these were some of the tenets he believed in, and he mingled with British superiors on a fairly equal footing, which was quite unusual for that time because there's a lot of prejudice against Indian engineers in the PWD and so on. Having said all that, in the 1910s, 1920s, when he's no more Diwan of Mysore and he's no more employed directly by the colonial state, he becomes free for the first time to participate more directly in political matters. And the first major political sort of participation he does is he's part of this group of leaders from across India who are meeting to condemn the excesses following Jallianwala Bagh and the Punjab repression. And they are calling for the release of political detainees. They're calling for an all-parties conference or all stakeholders conference between the British, the Viceroy, and various Indian leaders, which is essentially what we know as the Roundtable Conference. It happens 10 years later, but they're pushing for this in 1921. He's part of the delegation that goes with Malaviya to meet the Viceroy. Eventually, they organize an all-parties conference in the Kawasji Jahangir Hall of Bombay University. And it's a 3-day conference, leaders from across the country. Gandhi is there as well. He's not formally participating. But C. Shankaran Nair is the chairman. He fights with Gandhi and the other organizers over something, steps down, and Visvesvaraya becomes the chairman. This engineer who received his degree in the same hall 40 years ago becomes a chairman of a national, all India gathering of political leaders. I think this is fascinating, and he's also a member of various committees and the key orchestrators here are Jayakar, M.R. Jayakar, and Madan Mohan Malaviya, who are also moderate Congress leaders at that time. And so it is Jack, and so in the 1920s, what are Indian politicians asking for? They're asking for what's called self-government. They're not asking for Purna Swaraj, that comes later. So they're asking for self-government within the British Empire. And what is that? That takes the form of something called dominion status, by which they meant you should have the same status as self-governing British dominions like Australia and Canada. Right? So you have your own government, you have your own head, you have your own policies, you have fiscal autonomy, economic autonomy, ability to set tariffs, and so on. And this is precisely what Visvesvaraya was asking for from 1920 when he wrote his book, Reconstructing India. And so that's the background in which he's involved in this push for dominion status. So M.R. Jayakar is a Swarajist. He becomes part of the Bombay Legislative Council. He's trying to contact labor politicians in Britain. He's trying to contact the governor of Bombay. He's trying to put forward a proposal for a dominion constitution, right? This is the basis. This is what we want. And this is the context in which he gets Visvesvaraya, because he's been thinking about this, to write a draft constitution. It's a very short constitution. It's a typescript that's available in the National Archives of India. There's also letters between them. Visvesvaraya says, don't put my name to it, but I'll do it for you. Essentially, it's saying these things. It's specifying, he's drawing from Canada, he's drawing from Australia, he's specifying the kinds of, the kind of franchise. It's not universal adult franchise, by the way, at this point. He's talking about the kind of electoral system. He's talking about the kinds of the houses of parliament that was needed, the kinds of the relationship between the Indian Dominion, the putative Indian Dominion, and the British Empire and other members of the British Empire. He's talking about the importance of economic autonomy. He's talking about the various the relationship between the state at the center and the provinces. So he wants decentralization so that provinces can utilize their natural resources better. So he's going into a lot of detail. And then there's a second part, which is an enormous, it's a rant, really. It's amazing. And he says that, it's amazing that these people this is a kind of government which is not pushing for development. And it is a government which is basically just keeping the status quo. And people have to take out, rallies and talk about this and push for it. And he's outspoken in a way that he's never in other contexts, because of course his name is not on it. But it's a fascinating insight into his evolving political views. I think when he starts focusing on industrialization, he starts becoming a more and more outspoken critic of the colonial government. Though he's never member of a political party, he's never an outspoken revolutionary. He's seen as someone who's on close terms with the establishment, but he becomes more and more outspoken in his critique. By the 1940s, he's really lambasting the colonial government for its lack of policies towards industrialization during World War II and so on.
Even on
So,
education.
that's the broad arc of his political development.
So there is a question from Dr. Bala Ramaswamy. The topic had to come up. Krishnarajasagar Dam. Did I have any problems when he faced when the Great Dam was constructed? He had seen 2 world wars. Was he comfortable during that period? And Badri has an additional question about did the dam inundate any heritage monuments and so on.
Okay. I'll take the second question first. I haven't come across any information about that. We do know that some villages had to be relocated. Naturally, there's a lot of areas that were submerged. I think there may have been 1 or 2 very small temples. I can't remember exactly, but I've seen a lot of archival documents. But nothing on the scale of Abu Simbel or something, or Nagarjunakonda, monastery kind of a thing. So nothing on that scale, but there may have been small changes. It's one of my regrets that I haven't been able to find out more about whether there was opposition from people who were displaced and so on. There is some suggestion that they were well compensated, not monetarily, but by creating alternative villages where they could, then have irrigation facilities, and they were resettled and so on. But of course, these are coming from official sources, so we don't know if there were, there were other viewpoints to this. Having said that, I have a very detailed chapter in the book on the whole backstory of the Krishnarajasagar Dam, and indeed it was a very huge exercise for Visvesvaraya to push for this project, because there were several opponents to it, not least members of his own government who said it was a financial extravagance. Because remember, he's pushing for something which we now call deficit financing. He's saying any advanced government, progressive government, must take on debt to create a productive asset, which will give you revenues in the future in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And whereas there's a fascinating exchange with the financial controller, where they're writing these wonderful letters to each other, and the other guy is saying, you can't do this. What about, if there's a famine tomorrow? How are we going to feed people? How can you, this is reckless. Sorry?
The Jnansaran Chakravarti, somebody like that.
Yes, Jnansaran Chakravarti. And it's a very interesting exchange. And Visvesvaraya, of course, is saying that, you're only interested with, tallying your figures, and you're not interested in taking the long view, and this and that. And but he is pushing for this kind of state investment in productive projects. So that's one battle he's fighting. It's unknown, unheard of at that time, right? Because most of the colonial governments and princely governments are trying to maintain status quo. The other opposition comes from the Madras government, which is, of course, under British India. And that's because the Kaveri is going eastward into Madras presidency, very crucial to Tanjavur Delta. And they are planning right then the Mettur Dam. And they're worried that if this new dam comes on upstream, then there's not going to be enough water for the Mettur Dam. So there's a huge back and forth between Madras engineers, Mysore engineers, the Viceroy, the irrigation, the Inspector General of Irrigation for India. Visvesvaraya is at the center of all of these parleys. he's also having to negotiate with the British companies of gold mining companies of Kola, who are going to be the fundamental, the main customers of the electricity generating part of this project. Because if they don't buy electricity, the project doesn't pay for itself. And they are negotiating for more
It
favorable
really needed to be a
rates.
multi-purpose project. It was not just agriculture.
Absolutely. So it was supposed to be irrigation as well as electricity, and then therefore indirectly to help industrialization as well. And one of the things Chakravarti was saying is that, you're being very clever. You're combining the irrigation figures with the electricity figures, and it's the electricity which is earning money. And you're saying that the whole thing is financially sound, but it's actually the irrigation part doesn't make sense financially. That was his argument. Anyway, so there's a lot of detail one can go into, but the story doesn't end there. It finally gets it sanctioned in 1911. It takes 21 years to build. There are 6 or 7 other chief engineers after Visvesvaraya's time, all of whom play an important role. There are further disputes with Madras. There's a arbitration board in the 1920s. And so this is something that goes on. And, there's also the story of how they built a dam with wider foundations than was necessary in anticipation of getting later winning the dispute and getting sanctioned to build a higher dam. So there are all of these kinds of calculations going on. It's quite a dramatic story. I can't do justice to it right now, but it's in the book.
Yeah, no, I read that part. I read those chapters, and they were extraordinarily well written, and very detailed and very interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask. The objections came first from the British officials of Madras rather than the Tanjavur farmers, and
Yeah,
then
on behalf of the Tanjavur farmers, but we
yeah,
don't know what the farmers really were saying.
yeah. Okay. So that's very nice. Gauri has a continued question asking, did Visvesvaraya clash with the government in post-independent Indian government? Do you have any clashes with those people? What
Yes,
did
he
that
did.
achieve?
He did. I mean, he criticized the post-independence government, as I said, on the grounds that they were concentrating too much on the public sector, um, and that they were not giving enough room for private enterprise, that they were nationalizing industries. Um, he was not happy with the rate of investment in industrialization. In fact, in 1938, there's something called the National Planning Committee, which was set up by Congress leaders, emerging Congress leaders. This is in anticipation of some kind of independence. And Visvesvaraya was originally on it, and he stepped down soon because he said, I want the committee to commit to setting up 2 basic industries in every province. And of course, Nehru said this is not possible. We need to debate it and this and that. And it was just basically too slow and too ponderous for his liking. And so he quit. And so this kind of relationship continues after independence. There's mutual respect. There's a fundamental compatibility in their worldviews. But Visvesvaraya differs on these points of the role of the state, the role of public sector, uh, you know, uh, the kind of the role of capitalism and capital, basically. And he's at this time the perpetual president of a body called the All India Manufacturers Organization. And every year in the presidential speech, he makes these points and he makes these criticisms. But eventually it's not held against him. He wins the Bharat Ratna the same year as Nehru. Um, and um, and of course they're on talking terms and so on, but he's not he's too much of a hot potato for them to give a formal position to in the government. Although he's doing other things, he's advising the Mysore government in the 1950s on a village development plan when he's 90. So there's a lot of things there. I think from the point of view of historical hindsight, I think the similarities between Nehru and Visvesvaraya are actually more striking than the differences. But at that point, this was their kind of divergence. There's also somebody who gives an anecdote. I'm not sure if this is verifiable, but about the time when Visvesvaraya is going on talking, and then Nehru is on the stage in some function, and then he refers to him as Motilal Nehru. He gets corrected, and then he says, your father is more kind of my contemporary. So, that's sort of it.
I remember reading in biography of Rajaji when the Bangalore College, Central College, when he honored him, he was nearly 80 and he thought he'd be the oldest surviving person to be honored. And they brought in Visvesvaraya, was 20 years older than him, and he was just shocked.
It's great that you mentioned Rajaji because they were good friends. And of course, they're alumni of the same college. And I think Rajaji, of course, forms a Swatantra party, and there's something else associated with their associates called the Forum of Free Enterprise. And there's very direct connection between Visvesvaraya's associates and these kinds of things. So Visvesvaraya is of that, that's the form of critique that he's taking, the what becomes the Swatantra party critique of the Nehru member.
I think we're running out of time, but I'll ask one last question perhaps. Uday Kumar wants to know whether there was any controversy around his resignation. What's the story there?
Yeah.
As the Diwan was just forced out, or did he, was unhappy, something like that?
Yeah, it was a soap opera really. There was lots of letters going back and forth between Visvesvaraya and the Maharaja. Several times he threatened to resign. He actually threatened to resign much even before he was Diwan, when he was chief engineer, when the KRS project was not being approved. At that time, the Maharaja said okay, and he approved it. But the bone of contention essentially was reservation. And in the 1910s, in the late 1910s, it's of course the time of the growth of the non-Brahmin movement, the Justice Party in Madras Presidency, and that spills over into Mysore state, and there are representations being made for reservation of various kinds, and they find an ally in the Yuvaraja, the younger brother of the Maharaja, who, as belonging to the royal arist caste, see them or were seen as also non-Brahmin, although they were elite. And so there's a political moment where the Maharaja realizes that he has to acknowledge this change, and he has to do something about it. And he introduces or proposes to introduce reservations as something called the Miller Committee report, which comes out. And Visvesvaraya at that time was, had a very conventional view of reservations, which of course many people share today. There's a debate; many people have different views. His view was that reservation was not meritocratic, and that the way to go about leveling the playing field was to focus on primary education and give scholarships at the lower levels. And indeed he did that. I mean, as Diwan, he scaled up primary education, he gave lots of scholarships and so on. But he was unable to, to accept that there were certain hereditary advantages which the traditional elites enjoyed, which allowed them to perform well academically and otherwise. So his view was very simple. He said, if they're doing well, why do you penalize them? Right? So I think there can be different views on this, but whether he was right or wrong is up to you to decide. But he resigned essentially because he was against reservation, but also in general, he was a person who had many fantastic, not fantastic, but very very ambitious schemes, and very often, the reality of politics was that the royal family could not give him absolute backing the way he demanded. And so I think if not of the reservation issue, there would have been some other issue, probably Bhadravati Iron, which would have prompted him at some point to quit the divanship. That's my personal reading, but that's speculation. I just want to say very briefly, we didn't talk about the process of writing the book, Ashwin, but I just wanted to emphasize that one of the pleasures of this whole process has been reading the letters that these people wrote to each other, the elaborate and beautiful way in which they wrote reports, and the fact that they were so erudite even when they're fighting with each other. I think this is something that makes archival research very very pleasurable. Also, reading newspaper accounts at that time, seeing what's happening. There's also there was a person, an anonymous critic of Visvesvaraya, who wrote scurrilous letters to the newspapers for a long time. Visvesvaraya's rebuttals. All of this makes for very interesting reading. So I think we tell students in history that we need to always go back to what we call the primary sources, and I think that is the thing that I enjoyed most.
Delightful, absolutely delightful. Aparajith, of course, it's time to close now, and I'm going to invite Gauri to deliver the vote of thanks. But I think You did mention earlier on in this conversation that one of the difficulties you grapple with in your life is unable to see things only in black and white, and the gray kind of torments you. But from what we hear about Sir M Visvesvaraya from you, he didn't have any of that problem. So on that note, I'll invite Gauri to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you so much for an absolutely delightful
Thank
evening
you
of
both. I
conversation.
really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I love the book too. So
Yeah, that was wonderful. And as Ashwin said, delightful is one of the adjectives which we can safely use. And regarding black and white and gray, I think diplomacy is perhaps another phrase which we should use. And from whatever I could make out through this entire 1.5 hours, one thing you are is diplomatic, Aparajith. No matter what your personal views are on Visveswaraya or the book, you're very diplomatic in the way you mention it and talk about it. And that's really great. I think it's something we all need to learn from you. Wonderful it was. And thank you so much for the audience. We hope to see you next month on the first Saturday for the THT's next talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you, Gopu.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.